Hello and welcome to the AggieCon MT podcast series, part of the AggieConMT.com website and the AggieCon MT project produced by the Department of Agricultural Economics and Economics here at Montana State University. I'm Anton Beckerman, and today I'm joined by Joe Jansen, a fellow professor here in the department. Hey, Joe.
Hey, Anton.
And we are talking pulses today, and this is actually part of our ongoing series of talks that were presented at the 2017 Ag Conference that the department hosts here at MSU. And the conference was in its 11th year, and this is something that we hold annually in the first or second week of November, where we invite producers and agribusiness managers and lenders in the ag industry and all others interested in the what's going on in the economics of agricultural sectors here in Montana and in the region to the MSU campus, and we give them outlook talks, we give them analysis that come from our research portfolios. And so this is a way for us to communicate what we're doing to the ag industry, and as well as the ag industry to provide their feedback and their questions to us so that we know what to work on next. So this was another very successful conference, and what we decided to do this year is to take many of the presentations that were presented at that conference and put them at podcast form so that those who were not able to attend could get a sense of what was going on there and get that information. So, as I mentioned, today we're going to focus on pulse crops, and part of Joe's research is looking at pulse markets here in Montana and the northern U.S., as well as global pulse markets, and he can tell you a little bit about what pulse markets are in general, and then we'll get into some harder questions.
So, Anton, when we're talking about pulse crops, we're talking mainly about, at least in the northern Great Plains, three major crops, which would be dry peas, lentils, and chickpeas. Really, any dry bean could fit in the category of pulses, but at least especially for Montana, really those three crops are sort of the primary pulse crops that we're thinking of. Those crops are nitrogen fixing, but they're also often used in food products. So that's sort of where they get their name. Pulse comes from the Latin for, I think has something to do with soup or stew. So what we've seen is over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, these crops have become more and more important. More and more acres planted to pulses in Montana and North Dakota, to the point where Montana and North Dakota are sort of the primary production region for these crops. The other region would be sort of the Pacific Northwest. And what we've seen is where, in 2005, we really had almost next to nothing in terms of acreage, maybe, a few hundred thousand, maybe 100,000 acres at the most. We're now sort of well over 1 million acres of pulse crops here in Montana, and production has grown along with that. And these crops have really become sort of not just a rotational option, but really a cash crop for many producers here in the state. Up until this last year, where we saw a major decline in production. So that's sort of the bigger overall production story, is the drought that occurred here in 2017. And we had Montana and U.S. production really down about 60%, or to 60% of where they were in 2016. So a huge production decline. And that production decline can occur because production is really concentrated in Montana and North Dakota, and those were the two states hardest hit by the drought. So
talk about the fact that, we've seen increasing trends in production. How does that compare to, can you give a little bit of a perspective of, are we at the level of corn or soybeans or wheat? Where are we? Is this the next major crop that we're going to be exporting by the thousands of tons, millions of tons, or is this still fairly concentrated here in the region?
Yeah, the production of pulse crops is certainly more concentrated than it is for wheat, and it's obviously in smaller scale. So, when we talk about world production of wheat, we're talking about hundreds of millions of metric tons. And when we're talking about world production of pulses, it's more like 5 to 20 million metric tons. So like an order or two orders of magnitude less. Production is growing, but production is growing for all crops if you take sort of a long-term view.
How has Montana's infrastructure adjusted to this, right? Montana and western North Dakota regions, they've been mostly dryland wheat producing and typically wheat and fallow. And I think the infrastructure, the marketing infrastructure, the grain handling infrastructure has really been developed for that. Have we seen an evolution to also handle pulse crops at this point, or are we still in that transition phase?
I think we're still in a transition phase, in part because I think was sort of the open question is how much pulse crop processing should occur in the production region. So, right, we have sort of these major, large scale facilities for handling wheat around our state. We have a bunch of sort of smaller delivery stations that were used to handle pulses, in part because a lot of pulses actually still were bagged and put in containers. So there's less bulk handling of pulses relative to wheat. But we have a growing number of elevators and processors buying pulse crops in Montana, and they're pretty well distributed now through the state, mainly in obviously the Golden Triangle and the Northeast, where sort of the bulk of the sort of crop production acres are.
So this sounds to me like there is an evolution and there's growing, market demand for these pulse crops, and that has to affect prices in some way. But I guess you tell me, what's been happening in the prices lately?
Well, so we've seen, I guess I would say, strong prices for the last 2 or 3 years, and there's a few reasons for that. I think we'll go into those maybe in a little bit. But over the last 2 years, we've seen incredibly strong prices for lentils, mainly in 2015 and 2016. And then more recently, in the last year, sort of chickpeas have been the star, where prices again have sort of reached record levels that we haven't seen over the sort of 10 or 15 years in which we've had sort of a price for pulse crops here in the state. So when you sort of start to compare, prices for pulse crops to prices for wheat, things sort of got you say it's a historic aberration in terms of where pulse crop prices were relative to wheat. So, for example, for between 2005 and 2013, the sort of the ratio of pea to wheat prices was around 1 to 1. Maybe moved up a little bit above that, maybe moved a little bit below that. Depends if you looked at spring wheat or winter wheat, but sort of in that range. We'd sort of say that was sort of a normal price ratio. And then in the last couple of years, that ratio has gone up over 2 to 1. In that case, it made pulse crops look like a really good option because the prices for those crops were much higher relative to the price of competing crops.
What do you mean by a really good option? A really good option in what sense?
For growers to think of when they're thinking of sort of planning rotations. And analyzing the relative profitability of different crops in those rotations.
And for those who may not be familiar with wheat and pulse crops, but maybe more familiar with corn and soybeans, how does that ratio? Why are we looking at those ratios? Is there something relatively similar in the Midwest, like the corn and soybean ratio?
Yeah. So in the I states, in sort of the Iowa, Indiana, and Illinois area, right? That ratio is looked at as sort of how much acres are going to be allocated to one crop or another. And so historically, that ratio has kind of fluctuated around 2.5 to 1, soybean price being 2.5 times the price of corn. And so when that price ratio got much above that, people would sort of shift more towards soybeans. When it got below that, they'd shift back towards corn. So I think we're seeing, obviously, the rise in pulse crop acres and some of the decline in wheat acres being due to there is a competing crop that looks much more profitable. We could do sort of a full-on profitability calculation, sort of look at revenues minus costs, but that price ratio is a pretty good indicator, at least at first glance, of which crop is likely to be more profitable for growers.
So what's going on in this upcoming year? I guess let's break this question into two. First, let's talk about where is this ratio now in terms of producers looking at it and saying, well, maybe I should plant pulse crops or maybe I should plant wheat. And then after that, let's maybe talk about, well, why are these ratios going all over in these different directions?
Right. Well, so a couple of things. The caveat to point out here is these two markets aren't maybe as closely related as corn and soybeans. So I don't want to don't want people to get the idea that, well, so this ratio is really high. Pulse crops are much higher than wheat prices, so everyone will shift into pulse crops and the price of wheat will come back. I don't think that's the case, right? Because unlike the corn and soybean markets, which are sort of relatively similar size, and the U.S. Midwest is an important production region for both of those crops, the case here in Montana is that we're sort of a relatively small player in both of those markets. So even if if acres shift dramatically towards pulse crops going forward, I don't think we're necessarily going to see wheat prices sort of adjust and those prices sort of that ratio necessarily balance out. Now it is the case that ratio has been declining, right? Pulse crops are looking maybe less of a profitable option going into 2018. In part, that's because we've seen a little bit of strength in spring wheat prices, and in part, it's because prices especially for peas and lentils, have fallen off from where they were a few years ago. Now, chickpea prices still look really strong, and I think we'll see more acres moving to chickpeas going forward into the future. I was just looking at some new crop pricing for chickpeas today, and those prices are still around, depending on a number of factors, between $32 and $39 a hundredweight, or 32 to 39 cents per pound, which is still a very strong price in historical terms. So I think we will see chickpea acres increase for that reason. Maybe less so for lentils and peas, because that ratio is declining and we're seeing the incentives to plant those crops are diminishing. So
if a producer decides to go ahead and plant pulses, what are some of the issues that you've seen coming up in the 2018 production year that might impact their decisions?
So in my talk, I focused on two things, and I think these things still really apply, even though we're sort of a few weeks out from that. In fact, I think they're probably sort of thrown into more stark relief. So the two things being sort of some rotational constraints that we have with respect to how often we can plant pulse crops in our crop rotations that we use here in the state. And then the other thing is the export market situation. So maybe let's just sort of dive into the rotational thing first, and then we can sort of remind me to move on to exports in a minute.
I absolutely will.
Okay, so there are some limits on crop rotations, in part because these pulse crops, all of them, peas, lentils, chickpeas, are susceptible to a number of different crop diseases. And so for the prominent diseases in our region, there aren't many totally resistant varieties, and there aren't many fungicide options that can sort of totally inoculate us against the yield threat posed by these diseases. So that's the situation we're in. Crop rotation is really the management option that we have.
And just to jump in here, the yield threat is pretty significant. I mean, you can get, if you don't eliminate one of these diseases, you can go from 20 to 60 to 90% yield reductions. And so they're pretty serious. They're quite serious.
They're serious, and they're kind of long-lived. So once you get that disease pressure, it's not like it just sort of goes away. These diseases are persistent. And so for that reason, plant pathologists have been recommending limiting the frequency of pulse crops in rotation to, say, 1 in 3 years. And so we don't see a lot of sort of like wheat pea rotations. And in fact, we don't. The RMA, the Risk Management Agency, which sets the rules for crop insurance, says in their crop insurance contracts you cannot plant pea every other year. You have to plant it at least 1 in 3 years. Because some of these diseases are related across pulse crops, what growers may have been doing was going, say, wheat, pea, wheat, lentil, which now is following the rules, right? It's not planting the same crop more than 1 in 3 years. It's actually every 1 in 4 in that rotation. But because you'd planted peas 2 years before you planted lentils, you still had sort of increased potential for disease issues. So what the RMA said was, now you can't plant pea or lentil either one more than 1 in 3 years. So you'd have to put at least 2 years between those pulse crops. And so that's a rule that they've proposed to put in place for 2019. And it really points to sort of, well, how frequently can we plant pulse crops? And some of the growers that I've talked to have said, I love pulses. Pulse crops have been a significant driver of profitability on my farm, but I'm kind of capped out in terms of how much acreage I can plant. I'd love to plant more, but it's just not a good idea to do it. So there's a real question about how many more acres we can plant. I think with chickpeas, because they're so small, they're only about 100,000 acres in the state right now. I think there's room to move there to respond to this really strong price signal. But for peas and lentils, it's kind of an open question.
So certainly that's a constraint that may come on the production side. As I promised, let me come back to the demand side with the export market. So what is going on there? At first, I guess, why don't you paint a picture of how important are exports to the U.S. pulse market, and then dive in a little bit about what's been going on. Before we started recording, we talked about a pretty serious issue, and it would be great if you could elaborate more on that.
Yeah, so pulse crops, we don't grow them for ourselves alone. Export markets are crucial. 2/3 of U.S. pulses are exported. That's especially important for lentils. 85% of U.S. lentils are exported. So in that sense, we need export market demand to sustain the amount of acres that we're growing.
And where are they exported? What's the main region?
So South Asia would be the biggest region. Varies a little bit from crop to crop, but about 1/3 of our pulses are going to South Asia, and that's mainly India, right? India is sort of the biggest producer, processor, consumer. They are the biggest player in the market for pulses, and that's true for us. They're our biggest customer. For other pulses, there are sort of other important markets. So for peas, China is an important market. Sub-Saharan Africa is an important market, mainly for food aid. So we send a lot of yellow peas as food aid to Sub-Saharan Africa. For other pulse crops, it can be different parts of the world. Europe is a big destination for lentils and chickpeas. We transship a lot of lentils through Canada. So there's sort of an important, we need our neighbors to the north. While there are our competitors, they're also one of our customers. So we're heavily trade dependent. It just points to the need for, good working relationships. And, we've all heard a lot about sort of threats to the North American Free Trade Agreement, other major free trade agreements, to the WTO. So that is sort of under all this policy threat, and it really sort of puts the pulse industry on edge a little bit, because exports are so important. The most important market is India, and that market is not afraid of slapping major constraints on trade. So a lot of the run-up in pulse crop prices that we've seen over the last 3 years is due to India and the fact that they had major production failures there. The Indian government has this goal of food self-sufficiency. So obviously, if we're exporting a ton of pulses to India, they sort of see this as, we're not self-sufficient in food. We're reliant on these guys halfway around the world to feed us. They wanted to spur their own domestic production. They've done that, and that's part of why we've seen sort of weakness in pea and lentil prices relative to a couple of years ago. Their summer crop that they just harvested was below their 2016 record, but still a huge crop. So they've come back in a big way, and they started to impose tariffs to help boost domestic prices, because now that Indian production has responded, domestic prices are actually low, and farmers in India are very, very upset with prices in their country. And so the government there is trying to satisfy those concerns by raising prices in India. And one of the ways that they're going to do that is impose barriers to imports. So they did that for their spring pulse crops, so things like mung bean and other things that we wouldn't grow here, but they do some things that they do import from elsewhere in the world. Now, in the last few weeks, they've done the same for some of their winter pulses. So the big news on November 8th was we saw a tariff on dry peas coming into India of 50%. So if you want to import peas that are worth $6 a bushel, now you've got to pay this 50% duty. So an extra $3 a bushel just to get them into India. Obviously, that's going to stop trade. In addition, they've used other kinds of non-tariff barriers. So they had this They had some restrictions on fumigation that really made it difficult for Canada and the U.S. to import pulses to India. And so because they're such a big, important customer, because these kind of things can come out of the blue, I mean, I gave my talk on pulse crops on November 3rd, and I said, India, they can do all kinds of crazy things, but I never thought that they would sort of impose a 50% tariff, right, 5 days after the talk. Like, that was crazy. And it's really kind of cast a pall on new crop pricing. I think we haven't seen a lot of new crop bids for peas and lentils. And I guess the other shoe to drop would be if they put a tariff on lentils, then the same sort of thing would happen there.
So just explain very quickly how a restriction on trade, what that would do to the markets that people in Montana, producers in North Dakota, how does that translate into markets here? Are prices dropping? Are they just telling, those producers not to plant anything? How do these markets interact?
Well, so, I mean, I think the main mechanism is price, right? So we're seeing lower prices offered. You have to realize in this situation, this tariff was sort of totally out of the blue, to the point where you had ships, carrying pulses from North America on their way to India, and all of a sudden the companies who were selling those pulses were told, when that ship arrives in India, you're going to have to pay a 50% tariff on it, right? So, and ultimately that gets passed on to the farmer in the form of lower prices. So if you wonder why your local buyer isn't offering, good bids for lentils next spring, it's partly because that company sort of needs to hedge against the risk that something could happen before they have sort of the crop in the bin, in the elevator, moved over to that end user, that could cause them to end up getting a much lower price.
Okay, so let's start wrapping up. So why don't you kind of summarize 2 or 3 main points that you want our listeners to take away in terms of looking forward? What are the 2 or 3 factors that you think are going to be the main drivers of what we might see in the 2017-18 pulse marketing and production year?
Yeah, so I mean, all this said, and I think there's a bunch of negative news, but the relative prices still make pulses a very attractive crop choice for growers in Montana. But I think growers have to evaluate sort of where do pulses fit in my own personal crop rotation, and guard against the risk of some of these disease wrecks. If growers are looking for more information about that, I know Mary Burrows in the plant pathology department here at Montana State has some excellent information about sort of that decision and the risks that exist there. And I encourage you to check out the information that she's put out. She's put out an MSU Ag Alert on some of these rotational issues, and I encourage you to look at that. Those rotational limits will eventually bind. And so I think in the long run, sort of the takeaway message is we need to make investments in R&D to develop new varieties, to develop ways of dealing with the agronomic concerns that we have with respect to crop production here in Montana. I think growers have done a relatively good job of that. I mean, growers have made significant investments, but it's sort of like a treadmill. If you stop, those benefits dry up pretty quickly.
And as someone who has tried to run on a treadmill and stopped and fell over, I speak from personal experience that you probably don't want to do that.
Sounds painful.
It sounds painful, that's right. What's not painful, of course, is you continuing to listen to this and other episodes. And if you enjoyed listening to this one, you want to check out more podcasts about topics that were covered at the Ag Conference. This is financial stress in wheat markets. Other topics are land values and what's been happening to those, and rural communities and population changes there. You can certainly check all of those out on the AgEconMT.com website. We have a full archive of past episodes there, and you can also subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to these podcasts. So with that, thanks so much, Joe, for coming in and talking to us about pulses. Really
Thanks,
interesting
Anthony.
stuff, yeah. And we'll certainly continue monitoring the situation and bring you any updates that come along. And perhaps next time we might, get a scoop on what's happening in India, but perhaps not. So
it'll be interesting.
It'll be interesting. That's right. So with that, I'd like to conclude, and as always, wish that the weather is always in your favor.